Okay, now what we're going to talk about now is the idea of willingness to communicate. And this is a bit of a sort of added extra to the course, but it's an important area and it brings together some of the ideas that we've been looking at in other sessions. So willingness to communicate, if you like, builds on the work that's been done in language anxiety, in language learning motivation, and also builds in some of the more general themes that have developed in SLA. So it's a good idea to refresh your memory on what we've discussed about language anxiety and about motivation. But if we focus on motivation a little bit for now, we can say we remember the work of Gardner, and we remember talking about integrative motivation and the idea that learners may be motivated to learn a language because they want to become part of a sort of target language speaking community. They want to be accepted members of a different cultural group. And essentially all of that is driven by a desire to communicate. And this idea of a desire to communicate has been captured also by concepts such as international posture, the ideas of xenophilic and sociocultural orientations, the acculturation processes, all these kinds of concepts within the field of SLA that can be seen as referring to an intergroup attraction. So the major motivation to learn another language is to develop a communicative relationship with people from another language group. Now, we've got that desire to communicate on the one hand, but we also know that language learners experience, for example, language anxiety within the language classroom. So that can be seen as a worry or emotionality that is usually negative, that is associated with second language learning. And we talked previously about that being understood as a trait, a personality trait, but also as situation-specific anxiety or state anxiety. Now, within the field of SLA, having started with the work in motivation, there has been a considerable expansion where we now see lots of different motivation concepts in SLA. So we've got self-determination theory, we've got physiological approaches, we've got learner autonomy, task motivation, the process model, the L2 motivational self-system, or the critical qualitative perspective. And all of these have touched on aspects of motivation, and they're not always saying the same thing. So Dernier comes into this discussion and says, well, can't we just all get along? Can't we take a little bit of each one of those? And that can sound a bit sort of a bit of an easy way out, if you like. But essentially what Dernier is saying is that perhaps many of these controversies or disagreements that we see in L2 motivation research actually can be traced back to an insufficient temporal awareness. In other words, what he's saying is that these theories don't necessarily contradict each other or exclude one another, but may actually relate to different phases of motivated behavioral processes. In other words, at different times of the language learning process, perhaps different motivational concepts play a different role. So this idea of time is something we need to focus a little bit more on. So the idea that different motivational processes occur before, during, or after the learner's behavior, and that motivational approaches will implicate a particular time frame. So, for example, a focus on longer lasting processes may be what we mean, what integrative motivation refers to. So integrative motivation is not a one-off, it's not a specific moment in time, but it's a longer lasting process. At the same time, we can look at task motivation as something that is focused more on rapidly changing events. So actually putting time into sharp focus then allows us to think about those specific moments in the classroom where learners make decisions to take action or not to take action. So coming back to the idea of willingness to communicate, willingness to communicate can be seen as a particular decision at that moment in time where students' motivation as well as students' perhaps anxiety come together to either generate action or to avoid action. So either the learner engages with the action or avoids that particular action. And Dernier and Otto talk about this as crossing the Rubicon. And the Rubicon was a particular river within the Roman army context. It can be understood where actually the Romans were having to make a decision to cross the Rubicon or not to cross, and there would be no going back if they decided to cross that river. So Dernier and Otto use this to talk about the language learner Rubicon. So we can think think of different points within the language learning classroom at which the learner is making decisions whether to go forward or whether to stay where they are. So whether that's, do I raise my hand to answer a question? So maybe the learner is thinking, well, I should try. I must talk if I want to learn. But on the other hand, what if I make a mistake? What will others think of me? So there's that kind of decision process that is being weighed out. Another example might be, do I offer assistance to a second language speaker? So we might think I should help if I can. It's an opportunity for L2 contact. On the other hand, I might think, well, can I make myself understood? Will someone with better second language skills help instead? Again, weighing out the should I, shouldn't I, and what are the stakes there. Similarly, do I try to use the second language in conversation? Maybe I want to say something, I want to talk to that person, but on the other hand, what course might the conversation take? What kind of embarrassment awaits me? So at all these points, we can say we see learners' motivation interacting with perhaps anxieties or emotionalities that they have, worries that they have. So does a learner speak when the opportunity arises? And this is where willingness to communicate would say that we have a number of different processes that are interacting. Particularly, we see a collision between motivation and language anxiety. But we see other things as well. For example, we see the question bridges. So we have the interpersonal communicative processes. We have the intergroup contact. We have the educational process of language learning. And those are perhaps aspects that will allow a bridge between the learner's motivation and the learner's anxiety, or they may actually deter that, and so we see communication not taking place. Okay, so willingness to communicate is seen to be a concept that perhaps brings all of these different aspects together. And this has been worked on primarily by McIntyre and also colleagues such as Baker and Clement and so on. And they've developed what they call a pyramid model, and it looks very much like a pyramid. And there are a number of features to this model. So first of all, it's a layered heuristic model. So it brings in different aspects at different stages. And the idea of the pyramid model is to capture the concept of times. So the strength of the model is that it builds in the different levels of influential factors that build towards the communication behavior of the learner. So if you look at the model, we can see the communication behavior is right at the top of the pyramid. So that is that moment in time where the learner decides to communicate, decides to cross that Rubicon. But as we go down the pyramid, we see the different factors that have played a part in that decision to communicate. So closest to the communication behavior, we see the behavioral intention. Then before that, we see the antecedent, so whether that's the state communicative self-confidence, the desire to communicate with a specific person rather than with a general communicative intent. And we move further down until right at the bottom of the pyramid, we see the social and individual context. So what we're saying is this is a distal proximal model. In other words, all of these factors play a part, but they have a different level of influence depending on how near they are to the communication behavior. And so at the biggest macro level, we see the intergroup climate, we see the personality, we see the social individual context, and that becomes more fine-grained as we get closer to the communication behavior. Now, willingness to communicate was originally an L1 concept and was seen as trait-like. So it was part of a personality, if you like. But as it's been developed in the L2 learning context, we've come to see it more as a state of readiness. So initiating communication as a matter of choice. And that matter of choice is important in our understanding of willingness to communicate because we can see it then as a volitional act. Just briefly stepping into the understanding of volition. So this is a long history in psychology and also in philosophy. But the idea of volition was pretty much abandoned because it sort of related to ideas of free will, and these concepts were seen to be very difficult to research, very difficult to really understand and to pin down. But volition actually offers us the potential to understand how multiple and perhaps sometimes contradictory impulses may affect action. So studying volitional choices demonstrates that sometimes opposing processes can converge to affect second language communication. So, for example, we might have the process of approach, wanting to do something, but also certain processes of avoidance. So we saw examples previously where we talked about, for example, the learner asking, do I raise my hand to answer a question? So an approach process might be the learner thinking, I should try, I must try to talk in order to learn. But then we have the avoidance process. What if I make a mistake? What will others think? And these two things can come together sometimes. They can converge to actually encourage the learner to communicate. Now we're going to look a little bit at some of the research that may clarify this a little bit. First of all, we have the work of McIntyre, Babin and Clement, so a study conducted in 1999 based on previous research as well, where they conducted a pre-test of willingness to communicate with learners. Then they asked learners to whether they wished to participate in communication in L1 in a laboratory setting where they were given easy and difficult tasks. They were given oral tasks, they were given written tasks. Now this was students were given the option to communicate, to attend these L1 laboratory setting tasks. Those who came to the laboratory were seen to have higher willingness to communicate than those who did not, and you'd expect that because they were actually freely seeking out opportunities to communicate. And the willingness to communicate predicted the initiation of communication in both oral and written forms. Now, that doesn't surprise us. We would expect that those who are more willing to communicate are also likely to seek out more initiations of communication in written and in oral context. But that's important because we know that communication in oral and written forms is very important for language development. And so what that tells us is that actually willingness to communicate is influencing the degree to which students seek out those opportunities, and the degree to which they seek out those opportunities influences their language development. Another study, Baker and McIntyre, looking at English-speaking students who were learning French in immersion programs and learning French in non-immersion programs, so comparing students across these different conditions. And they looked at situations where each of these groups of learners were seen to be most willing to communicate or least willing to communicate. So what they were looking for here was any themes across these particular situations or any emotional expression. What they found was that looking at the situations where the groups were most willing to communicate, immersion students seemed to have weaker emotional reactions in those situations than non-immersion students. So maybe their level of enthusiasm was less strong than the non-immersion students, while non-immersion students were pleased with even small successes. So they give one nice example where a student says, my father has a tailoring and bridal shop, and one day a French-speaking lady came in. My dad's wife can speak French, but she was off that day, so I was able to help her out enough so that she would come back. And this was expressed as a non-immersion student's sort of experience of success and something that generated great pleasure for that particular student. In terms of the situations where the students were least willing to communicate, this was an interesting finding because firstly they found that immersion students experienced stronger emotion in those situations. But the more interesting finding was that actually both for immersion and non-immersion students, the type of event that upset them was perhaps Francophone interlocutors switching to English. But the interesting thing was that actually was motivating for both groups of students. So because the Francophone decided to switch to English, that meant that both groups of learners were more motivated to try and improve their language in order to avoid situations like that again. So that negative experience actually ended up having a positive motivational effect on the learners. It was a driving experience, suggesting that actually willingness to communicate is not necessarily motivated simply by positive affirmation or positive experiences of trying to use the language. Okay, and there are other studies that you can look at. We're really just having a very brief introduction to this area just to make you aware of it. But the work of McIntyre is one to follow because he's very much placed an emphasis on this. But perhaps a key idea to take away is that at the moment of decision, at the moment at which the learner decides whether to communicate or not, there are a number of different factors that can increase or decrease the likelihood of them crossing that Rubicon, of them making that decision to communicate. And these can be psychological, pedagogical, they can be situational, linguistic, or even socio-political. And the influence of those particular factors will vary. They will wax and wane over time. And all of this can be understood perhaps by referring briefly to Kurt Lewin's field theory, where he would argue that action is based on a totality of coexisting, mutually interdependent facets. This is where willingness to communicate is a helpful concept to think about, because in much of SLA research, the focus is often placed on one particular aspect at any given time. So perhaps we're looking at motivation, or perhaps another study looks at anxiety, perhaps another study looks at aptitude. Willingness to communicate is actually a model that is saying, no, these things are interacting all at once. All of this, the interaction between all of these different factors are what constitutes the learner's decision to act in certain ways in the classroom. And that's what this field theory of Kurt Lewin is also arguing, that these that action is based on interdependent facets that all interact at any given time. That actually we need to understand that there is general life and there is also momentary influences, that both of these things come together, that there are driving forces and there are restraining forces, and that these interact at any time to either encourage a learner to communicate or actually holding a learner back from communicating. So second language learning is complex. It's all of these things coming together. And actually, if that's where future research could perhaps make a useful contribution, looking at the combinations of multiple driving and restraining forces, perhaps focusing on the moment, but also on state level processes, and increasing the complexity of models. So actually looking at interactions between more factors as well. So future research in SLA should focus on the momentary restraining forces that come into play when a speaker is choosing whether or not to initiate communication. So just to briefly summarize perhaps 5 key points. First of all, the relationships among variables under study in SLA might change substantially when concepts are defined at different levels of abstraction. So whether it's state, whether it's situation specific, or whether it's trait level. The major motivation to learn another language, we've said, is to develop a communicative relationship with people from another cultural group. But thirdly, the manner in which motivation affects language learning changes as the time frame under the study changes. And this is something that motivational research is beginning to incorporate as well. Studying volitional choices demonstrates that opposing processes do seem to converge to affect second language communication. And finally, we can say that future research in SLA should focus on those momentary restraining forces that come into play as a speaker chooses whether they're going to initiate communication or not. So more complex models that look at the interaction between state level trait and also situation specific as well.